So this is our second day of poetry, and the lecture today is primarily on Paul Celan's poem called Death Fugue. And I'm going to get to that in a minute, and that'll occupy most of our time today. I wanted to show you something because we hadn't, I mentioned this before, that a number of us hadn't seen the concentration camps and the death camps as they currently exist, because most of us probably haven't taken trips to Europe to go to these camps. Now, some of you may have, and if you have, it's a profoundly moving experience to enter into a space some obviously 6 or 7 decades later and try to begin to comprehend what had happened there. Many of the concentration camps are still extant throughout Germany and Poland. That is to say, there are often memorials that are there, and sometimes some of the barracks or some of the actual remains of the camps are still visible today. Most of these, at least within Germany, the major camps, Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Buchenwald, but also camps outside of Germany like Auschwitz, have also been turned into museum places where people can go and actually walk through the space of the camp. I thought I'd show you a couple of these using Google. This is Google Maps, obviously, but I ticked a couple of the places, particularly Sachsenhausen, Auschwitz, Dachau, the location of the Wannsee Conference House in Germany, as well as Buchenwald. And I just want to show you those spaces very briefly today. So you have to zoom in, obviously, a lot. Oops, too much. And this is Sachsenhausen. And what's interesting about Sachsenhausen, and I'll just go to the map view so you can sort of locate where we are. This is outside of Berlin. Oh, too far. Let's go back in a little bit. Berlin, Berlin is here. The camp of Sachsenhausen is just outside of the city, so it's where that little ring is. It's not very far. You can take a train there today. You can take a regular train from the main station in Berlin to Oranienburg, which is the town where Sachsenhausen is, and this little triangle that's in blue right there is the camp itself. So if you looked very carefully with this is what it looks like in the map view. There's not really much there that would tell you that there's a concentration camp. But if you turn on the satellite view, it's actually really quite extraordinary. This gives you actually the location of where the roll call took place, which was all this area here. Prisoners would be assembled in this area on the front here. It was a kind of, obviously it's a circular formation so that all the people could be seen during roll call. In the back here, there were barracks that were built. Most of these barracks don't exist today. They've been torn down by the force of weather and so forth. A number of administrative buildings, as well as a number of buildings that were used for medical experiments, because Sachsenhausen was one of the places where medical experiments were done to prisoners, particularly a number of gay male prisoners who were taken there, and they did various experiments to try to cure homosexuality in this camp. Most of the prisoners came from Berlin, which during the 1920s was a very open, cosmopolitan, tolerant city, and had a thriving, in fact, gay community, and many of those people were sent to Sachsenhausen. This was also one of the earliest camps to open in Germany, Dachau being the very first, opening just months after Hitler came to power in 1933. Dachau is here. This is outside of Munich. This camp has a somewhat different shape, but one of the things that's interesting about both Dachau and Sachsenhausen is how close they border the urban environment. That is, people actually live next door to the camps. They lived there back in 1933, in the 1940s. They live there today. Basically, a concentration camp is essentially in your backyard. This raises, I think, a lot of interesting questions. I mean, not least of all, the fact that it's a profoundly unsettling thing to have a concentration camp literally a stone's throw away from your house. But also it raises questions about who lived there during the war. What did they know? What did they see? What happened? The amazing proximity between the regular kind of urban population of these places and the sheer number of people, tens of thousands, and in fact more than 100,000 in the case of Sachsenhausen, taken there, and some 50,000 in fact killed over the course of the war. Now, these were not death camps. That is to say, they weren't extermination camps. They were work camps. They were labor camps. They were detention centers. They were prisons. And they served various purposes depending on the time that we're looking at them. In the 1933, they were primarily detention centers. By the 1940s, there was a significant shift in the emphasis, and certainly because of starvation, malnutrition, mistreatment, medical experiments, and other things, a significant number of prisoners did die. These were where barracks used to be. This area on the front here was for roll call. If we go to Auschwitz, this is actually pretty extraordinary. The size is overwhelmingly large. And one of the things that's interesting about this is Auschwitz is actually not on the map. So if you're looking at the town, which is where near where Auschwitz is, and you look in Google, this is where Auschwitz is, but yet it's not actually indicated at all on the map. So how you find it, you have to turn on the satellite view. And this, I think, is so extraordinary that the technology today actually allows us to see things that are in some ways written off the map, or in some ways not actually indicated. This is the main railway line that came into Auschwitz. This entire region, just to give you a sense, like look how small the houses are up here. This is a very large region. It will take you almost maybe an hour to traverse the entire camp. It's so large. So the space that we're talking about, I don't have the exact dimensions here, but all of this were barracks. There are two different sets of barracks because prisoners were separated in different places. The train line that led in, the very famous Arbeit macht frei insignia, also something that's there, as well as now today a number of museums and other portions of the camp which contain a stunning amount of evidence about what happened there. One of the most troubling things, I think, one of the most disturbing exhibitions that they have at Auschwitz is actually an exhibit of about a ton of human hair. It's in massive tanks, almost big glass containers, and all you see is human hair. And this was because prisoners, before they were killed, were shaved, or before they were sent to work camps, were shaved, and that hair still exists today, and there's about a ton of it. And you can imagine how much it takes to get a ton of hair. Hair doesn't weigh very much. So think how many heads had to be shaved in order to get that amount. You can see it today. And so, when people sometimes ask questions like, what's the evidence? What's left over? Well, there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence of what's left over. There's a lot of remains, and there's a tremendous amount of things that bespeak the violence that happened there. The other major thing in Auschwitz are shoes. They have hundreds of thousands of prisoners' shoes. And so it's just overwhelming to see not just the size of the landscape and the amount of stuff that's there, but this evidence that bespeaks the violence that happened. Question? There was a, yeah?
Why did they save the hair? Why do you have this kind of hair? Why did they burn it along with
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of myths about the hair, about things that it might have been used for possibly, so to speak, keeping stuffing for in blankets to keep people warm, or things that Nazis may have done with it. There are also rumors about skin in the same way, that it might have been used for something. It was largely, it was largely kept because of the possible utility, quite honestly, of what it might have been. Yeah. It never has been it's never been decisively figured out. There's also prisoner roll books there. We have a record. The Nazis kept very good records about people who came in, where the transports came from, largely at the initiation of Eichmann, but also the fact that there was a tremendous bureaucracy that made it possible. There's a couple others that are interesting. The Wannsee Conference House here in Berlin. This is, if you zoom in a little bit, you can actually see the real house. That's it right there. Still standing. It looks just like it did in the film. It's a kind of palatial mansion. Of course, this is the view from above, and I don't think this exists I don't know if it exists in Earth view, but there it is. It doesn't exist as a three-dimensional object, but in any case, that's where the January 20th, 1942 meeting took place. Still intact, and today it's a museum. And you can just imagine, after the meeting, Nazis arriving here, after the meeting, looking out to the lake, enjoying lunch, and so forth. The final one I'll show you is Buchenwald. Buchenwald, I'll go back to the satellite view here. is that Buchenwald is actually one of the ones that's somewhat more closed off. It's surrounded by forest. And whereas Auschwitz is very close to the town, Sachsenhausen and Dachau actually are right there next to kind of urban spaces. Buchenwald is a little bit more removed. It's up on a hill, a kind of more mountainous terrain. It's outside of a very famous German city by the name of Weimar, Weimar. Weimar is famous because it's the birthplace of two of the most important German poets, Goethe and Schiller. It's a kind of cultural capital in many ways of Germany. It's a place where Johann Sebastian Bach was for a period of time, the great philosopher Nietzsche. It has a tremendous kind of connection to the cultural, intellectual, musical history of Germany. Weimar is extraordinary in terms of thinking about what's the German contribution been to culture. And amazingly, Weimar is really, that's Weimar over here. Weimar is very close to Buchenwald, and it raises this very strange and very vexing question that's really at the stake of, I think, the poem we're going to discuss today called Death Fugue. What's the relationship between culture and violence? How do these two things coexist, right? How do you have, this is the town of Weimar, the place where the greatest German poets, the greatest philosophers, the greatest musicians, all composed and thought and tried to come up with these tremendously creative contributions to human civilization, and then you have a concentration camp just in some ways not much more than a stone's throw away up in the mountains to pretty much eradicate human beings. Like, what's the relationship between these two things? How do they exist almost in contiguity with one another? Not to say that one caused the other, but how can they coexist? Like, what's the relationship between culture and violence? Why does culture not stop violence? You might remember back even to the Wannsee conference, I mentioned that 8 of the people who participated have advanced degrees, law degrees or PhDs. They were very educated people. They were very cultured. They read Goethe and Schiller. They listened to Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. They were smart people. They read the Bible. They were educated. They were cultured. They were intelligent. And they also used that intelligence and education and culture in the service of something terribly violent. And that raises, I think, a kind of fundamental paradox, almost at the heart of what we think about the human species. It's that potentiality that we have for doing things that are very good and things that are very evil. So this proximity, I think, illustrates that. So in any case, I'll continue to work on this file. I haven't actually mapped all the concentration camps by any means. I only got that far. If it's something that you're interested in doing, I would love for someone to actually map out this and take some time to locate them all for us, because it would be interesting, I think, from our perspective today, to look at from the our perspective in LA of what's left. What are the physical remains of these camps? So if that interests you, I'll talk to you about this project. Okay, so today we're going to Death Fugue, and I don't need this anymore either. And I'm actually going to begin by this a quotation here. This is the only PowerPoint slide I have, so I'm not going to turn the PowerPoint slideshow on. But this quotation is by a German philosopher, himself part Jewish, reflecting on Auschwitz in 1949 and really struggling, as many philosophers and thinkers and poets and artists did after 1945, to try to understand the significance of the Holocaust in these very early years. How is it possible to represent it, to come to terms with it? What does it mean for human beings that we have this potentiality to annihilate another group of people, or potentially to annihilate ourselves, all of us? So he says in 1949, and it's a somewhat maybe overblown statement, to write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric. It's become impossible to write poetry today. Impossible to write poetry today. What do you think this, why is writing a poem barbaric? Why has it become impossible? We've been looking at poetry already, and clearly people did write poems. What do you think that this meant? Yes, I think on the one hand, I think that's definitely getting at part of it. It's just the idea that poetry is traditionally, at least not always, but maybe traditionally associated with certain kind of aesthetic ideals, certain kind of a sense of the beautiful, the sublime, the elevated, the cultured. And now we're talking about something which negated those things, right? This is sort of the bottom of the bottom, the most horrific, the most incomprehensibly brutal of acts, right? How do you put that into poetry, right? How do you translate this brutality, this violence, these almost unimaginably horrific things, right, into verse? You get things like Frozen Jews, right? You get that poem by Sutzkever where he takes the absurdity, right, the absolute idea of seeing just body after body frozen and puts it into a kind of rhyming couplets, not in order to diminish it, but in order to understand it, to come to terms with it. And so here, it is possible to write poetry after Auschwitz. But in a way, we have to then ask, what does it mean to take something that has this history of the beautiful and the elevated and the sublime and think about that which is the most base and the most vile and the most violent? And then I think the other point that you made, which I want to raise as well, is how do you represent it? How do you convert it into words, right? One of the things that it comes up in Samantha Power's book a lot, and in others as well, is the incomprehensibility, right? How do you turn it into something that we can comprehend, get our heads around? What language would describe it? How do you tell someone something which just doesn't accord with any of our experience? It's so foreign. And so here's another question that this has raised is, it maybe has become impossible to write poetry today, in a sense because we don't have the language to describe these kind of events. In the same way that genocide required a new, Raphael Lemkin needed to coin a new word to describe a new kind of killing, one that had never existed, at least on that scale, with that kind of efficiency, that kind of brutality. Any other thoughts about this quote? Interesting to think about. It has a moralizing dimension too, I would say. I mean, it's something that Adorno, this philosopher, eventually actually distanced himself from this quote, actually changed and said, it actually is possible. And Celan was actually someone who he thought was one of the few poets who could, in fact, capture the violence and the brutality through verse. But there's a kind of moralizing aspect, too, which is poetry is now impossible. Perhaps art is impossible. Something has happened that's changed the way human beings create things that are beautiful. So, how do you write a poem about Auschwitz? Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, Jacob? Mm-hmm.
And it has to be especially hard for Germans to read much about it. So I think that maybe could fall apart.
Right, his German identity playing a part in making this point, and he was, like I said, he was part Jewish as well, but he was very much schooled in the German philosophical tradition, the German cultural tradition, and really thought that that German culture at this point, he said this as much in some of his writings after the war, is nothing but shit. That was basically the word he said, Scheiße. And it's rubbish, it's trash, because none of these things stopped Auschwitz. That is to say, we could be the most cultured, the most advanced, the most technologically sophisticated, make the best kind of art, the best music, and yet none of these things stopped the creation of Auschwitz. And so he basically is saying that these two things may, in fact, if one just utterly failed, in his sense, culture failed because it should have stopped Auschwitz, he also says that maybe culture is nothing but shit. So it's a very angry and I think you're right, self-searching question. All right. So today we're going to talk about this poem by Paul Celan called Death Fugue. And the poem was written in 1944 or 1945. We don't know the exact moment when it was written. One thing that is fairly certain, though, it wasn't written while he was in a slave labor camp. It was probably conceived while he was. You might remember he was for 19 months in a slave labor camp. He lost both of his parents in camps as well. And this is his first published poem. And the poem itself was actually written first not in German or English, but actually written in Romanian, which was his native tongue. So the very first version of this poem, called Death Fugue, was actually called Death Tango, or Dance with Death, or Dance Death, you might say. Death Dance. And I can show you that. I just want to get up these lecture links real quick. Make it slightly larger, but not a lot larger. But that's, unfortunately, it's not so great. But there was a little illustration at the top of, as you can see, arms here. And this was a poem called, in Romanian, Dance and Death. So Dance, Death. And it was accompanied, when it was first published, by a little information box by the publishers who said, and I'll just read this quote to you in English, "The poem whose translation we are publishing here," but it's in fact not a translation because this was the original, "is built upon real facts. In Lublin, as in many other Nazi death camps, one group of the condemned was forced to sing while others dug graves." So it says basically that what the poem is talking about, ostensibly this singing or dancing or orchestral idea, is not something metaphorical or something imagined or made up by the poet, but in fact a real historical reality that accompanied the work in the death camps themselves. So basically it's going to that point that we made last time, that this is not really about metaphors and symbolisms and allegories and things that stand for other things, but it's actually about reality. It's about realities that were suffered and things that were experienced, things that in many ways are incomprehensible in terms of their brutality. And so here's an example of what I mean actually happening. This is an orchestra from 1942 in one of the camps. And what you have here is an orchestra playing, often consisting of people who themselves were prisoners, forced to play while a condemned person who may have in fact been about to be shot, or beaten for various kind of things, was in the center. These kind of orchestras also accompanied work in labor camps. Sometimes you had groups of people who were selected to actually perform music in a camp while others dug their own graves, or toiled away in slave labor camps, digging in mines or quarries and other things like that. So this is the kind of historical reality of an actually existing death tango that existed in the camp. And one of the things that immediately comes to bear, and this already goes back to something I was talking about by the proximity between Weimar as cultural capital and Buchenwald as the site of violence, is the fact that you have these two things coexisting and intermingling, right? Music, the stuff that we consider to be the elements of culture, violins, horns, trumpets, musical compositions, an accordion, all of these things in a camp. I mean, and not just in a camp in order to provide like a background music, but in some ways to kind of produce this sense of just the sheer absurdity, that you can take all these elements of culture and bring them into the camp and really kind of, really find a way in which they commingle in a very uncertain way. So I think Ceylon at the very beginning is already reflecting on this notion. And you kind of have that, I think, by just the very title of this poem, A Death Fugue. A Death Fugue. In German, the word is Todesfuge, and he brings these two terms together. It's a coinage. It's a neologism. There is no word in German called Todesfuge prior to this poem. But so what you have here is a fugue, and a fugue is a very particular kind of musical composition, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it's now qualification, or maybe maybe not even a qualification, maybe its most vital expression. It's a death fugue, a death dance. So the poem itself, and I'll just, I'm hoping that you've read it before. I'm going to go through it just briefly here in order for us to at least just get the gist about its structure and also some of the references in the poem. Then we're going to listen to Ceylon himself read the poem, because I think that actually hearing the poet himself read the poem is going to be very instructive for us to understand the language, the rhythm, the cadences, and the emphasis that he places on the choice of words, as well as understanding its compositional elements, which are meant to be like a fugue. Then we're going to listen to a fugue. We're going to listen to the most famous, perhaps, fugue ever composed by Johann Sebastian Bach, which is the first part of his Art of the Fugue, composed around 1740. And one of the things that we'll notice between the two things is that the auditory component of this fugue is very much mimicked by the linguistic structure of the poem. And this also not only is reflected, in terms of structural elements and linguistic elements, musical elements, and so forth, but it also raises that bigger philosophical question about how the two things coexist, right? How the culture and the violence meld together. Okay, so here's the poem again. So, black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, we drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the air, there you won't lie too cramped. A man lives in a house, he plays with his vipers, he writes. He writes when it grows dark, to Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta. He writes it, and steps out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his hounds to come close. He whistles his Jews into rows, has them shovel a grave in the ground. He orders us strike up and play for a dance. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at morning and midday, we drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, and he plays with his vipers. He writes when it grows dark, to Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta, your ashen hair, Sulamit. We shovel a grave in the air where you won't lie too cramped. He shouts, jab this earth deeper, you lot there, you others sing up and play. He grabs for the rod in his belt, he swings it, his eyes are blue. Jab your spades deeper, you lot there, you others play on for the dancing. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at midday and morning, we drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, your golden hair, Margareta, your ashen hair, Sulamit. He plays with his vipers, he shouts, play death more sweetly, death is a master from Deutschland. He shouts, scrape your strings darker, you'll rise then in smoke to the sky. You'll have a grave then in the clouds where you won't lie too cramped. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at midday. Death is a master aus Deutschland. We drink you at evening and morning, we drink and we drink. This death is ein Meister aus Deutschland, his eye is blue. He shoots you with shot made of lead, shoots you level and true. A man lives in house, your golden hair, Margareta. He loses his hounds on us, grants us a grave in the air. He plays with his vipers and daydreams. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Hair, Margareta, dein aschenes Hair, Sulamit. So that's the poem, and I want to remark a little bit about the translation first off. This was translated by a professor at Stanford who's actually happened to have been one of my professors and is still a good friend of mine, John Felstener, who's one of the preeminent Paul Celan scholars, wrote a very important biography of Celan, talking about the genesis of many of his poems, including Death Fugue. And I mentioned this poem was first published in Romanian, then it was published in German, and this is an English translation of the German. But one of the things about this English translation, the German, is that Felstener, the translator, made a very conscious effort not to translate every single word. And so this Deutschland would be translated as Germany. He writes when it grows dark to Germany, your golden hair, Margareta. Or down here as we start, Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. It's death is a master from Germany. Your golden hair, Margareta, your ashen hair, Sulamit. He leaves parts of the poem actually untranslated. And this is very much intentional on his part, but it also means that you have this kind of vexed relationship between the original, the German original, and the English translation. And one of the things, and you can imagine all kinds of possible reasons why he might have done this, but one reason I think that's important for us is to recognize that this poem was written in German. That is to say, it wasn't written in English. It was written in German. It was also written in Romanian. And you might say it was written twice in some sense, once in the language of the victims and once in the language of the perpetrators. Romanian was certainly a language of victims. I mean, although there were also perpetrators who were Romanian, but certainly Jewish Romanian speakers were victims of this period. And those who spoke German, specifically when the German is used to ventriloquize the language of an SS officer or a person in charge of a Nazi, certainly this is German language, which goes towards that cold, the calculating, the brutal that we talked about last time. And Celan is always struggling with the German language. He's struggling to try to understand this language of poetry, of Goethe and Heine and Schiller and all these other great German thinkers, and the language of the Wannsee Conference, where the language was turned into Vernichtung, right, of just destruction. And so one of the things that the translator, I think, is doing here is showing that relationship between German, kind of pointing us back as English readers to the fact that this is a German poem derived from very particular kind of German language and at a particular time. So that's just one thing I wanted to say right off the bat, because it would strike us as odd that the translator doesn't fully translate the whole poem. Any other thoughts just about that, or just questions? I think, I mean, you may have recognized that as you read this translation, that not every line, not every word is actually translated. Okay. So, I mean, if you had other questions about it, we can talk about it. So what is, I mean, just to start off with just our understanding of this poem, if we just ask, what is it about? I mean, what's basically, I mean, what's going on? Who are the protagonists? In some sense, this is a snapshot of a story. There's a relationship here. There are people that enter into this poem. Something happens as the poem moves forward. So what would you say, I mean, if we had to just describe what's it about, what's going on here, what would you say? What's the, yeah. Someone says, yeah, you read Death Fugue, interesting poem. What's it about? You'd say, what? Sure, start us off.
Do we know who Margareta represents?
Well, that's definitely, we need to figure out who these people are, right? Who Margareta is, who Sulamit is.
Is it from Faust?
It is from Faust. And Faust is a very important work by Goethe, German poet again. Margareta is the kind of romantic German ideal of beauty. She's blonde, she's fair-skinned, she's a kind of romantic ideal. You might even say, I mean, this wouldn't be the words of Goethe by any means, but certainly would be the words of maybe Nazis in the 1930s. She's Aryan. That is to say, she's coming from a particular North European racial stock. Again, not the words of Goethe here, but the words of how a Nazi may have perceived this tradition in the 1930s. She's juxtaposed with someone else, Sulamit. Anyone look up who this is or find out who it is? Yeah? Who is? Sulamit. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Yeah, because the Sulamit is a woman, and no, not quite. It's a different kind of reference. I mean, it's a reference, actually a biblical reference. Anyone check and find out? So we have to know who these people are, right? So, I mean, one of the very basic questions of understanding this poem is if these two people are very important. She has golden hair, Margareta. The other one has ashen hair over here. Certainly, these two women are very important in this poem. But there's also other things going on. I mean, there's the person who's, the person who's calling up the Jews to dance, right? The person who's writing to Germany. He writes when it grows dark to Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta. I mean, just before we even talk about Sulamit, who is the he? Who's doing this writing? Most likely, I think so. Yeah, because what else does he do? He writes to Germany. He writes and steps out of his doors. The stars are all sparkling. I mean, this almost reminds me of Karl Hocker's poem, photographs, right? The SS officer in Auschwitz. I mean, who goes on little vacations, outside of Auschwitz. The stars are all sparkling in the sky. He writes to his wife, who he's been estranged from because he's working in Auschwitz. I miss you very much. I'm working very hard. I'm here stationed in Auschwitz. And then he whistles his dogs to come close, right? He whistles his dogs, his German shepherds. He whistles his Jews into rows. Give them a shovel. He orders us, strike up and play a dance. I mean, clearly the he here, I think you're exactly right, is certainly an SS officer, someone in charge of a camp, someone who's doing the ordering, the whistling. You here, dance. You here, play. You here, dig. You here, do this. And then at the same time, he writes letters to his wife or his lover or this woman, Margareta, built on a tradition of a kind of German ideal, someone he's estranged from. I mean, I see in many ways this is the experience of just any everyday SS officer like Karl Hocher, stationed in Auschwitz, calling up his dogs to go to get the Jews in a line to go, for selection, for work, for whatever, dig in the ground, dig a shovel, and then he goes back to his barracks and he writes letters to his wife, Margareta. It's interesting. In the German, by the way, there's like a small footnote. The word for hounds is here Ruden. These are actually very large dogs, and the word for Jews is Juden. The two rhyme. There's a kind of connection in the terms between dogs and Jews in Ceylon's poem. But it still hasn't answered our question. So we know that he's writing. He writes when it grows dark to Deutschland. He writes to Germany. He writes about your golden hair, Margareta. Your ashen hair, Sulamit. Who do you guess she is? Probably Jewish. Yes, probably Jewish. I think it's a good choice. Probably good. I mean, she's actually another ideal of female beauty, and a very significant one that's maybe not so familiar, but she comes from the Song of Songs, or also known as the Song of Solomon. This is, I don't know if you've read the Song of Songs before, but it's a book in the Hebrew Bible, and it's particularly a vision of female beauty which is not European. It's a vision of female beauty that's Middle Eastern, that's maybe from Lebanon or Damascus or somewhere in the Middle East. Someone who probably has different skin complexion, probably not fair skin like Margareta, probably not blonde hair, probably not blue eyes, but someone who has it's a different ideal of female beauty. And Ceylon brings these two together. And so here's how in the Song of Solomon she's described. So it comes at the end of chapter 6. I'll read a little bit to you. The Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, is basically a paean to female beauty. It's a kind of courting between a man and a woman, and you can interpret it in lots of ways, but that's one way. And one of the things that's so striking about the Song of Solomon is it's a very kind of sensual description of female beauty, some of which may strike us today as a little strange, but nevertheless, that's what it is. Return, O Sulamit, return, return. So a calling back to Sulamit, the woman, that we may look upon thee. What will ye see in Sulamite? As it were the company of two armies. How beautiful are thy feet with shoes. O prince's daughter, the joints of thy thighs are like jewels, the work of the hands of a cunning workman. Thy navel is like a round goblet, which wanteth not liquor. Thy belly is like a heap of wheat, set about with lilies. Thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins. Thy neck is a tower of ivory. Thine eyes are like the fish pools of Heshbon, by the gate of Bath Rabim. Thy nose is at the tower of Lebanon, which looketh toward Damascus. Thine head upon thee is like Carmel, and the hair of thine head like purple. The king is the head, is held in the galleries. How fair and how pleasant art thou, O love for delights. This is a description of female beauty of someone of a very different tradition than that of Margareta. It's a kind of, we might question the description today. I don't know if in a Valentine's Day card you might write to your girlfriend that thy belly is like a heap of wheat set about with lilies. She might get angry at you. I don't know. But she might think it's a very beautiful, because it comes from the Song of Songs. But certainly the description here of female beauty is one which is meant to call up and evoke a different tradition. In this case, it's very clearly it's an Old Testament or Hebrew Bible reference. It's one to a vision of female beauty that's different than European, that's not European. And yet the two are brought together in this poem. So, why is her hair here? Her hair is not golden, her hair is ashen. Your ashen hair, Sulamit, we shovel a grave in the air where you won't lie cramped. Clearly the reference here, I began to think how one's hair becomes ashen. Certainly it becomes ashen as we age, right? As we get older, our hair becomes gray. It also gets ashen if we're burned, right? So certainly the idea here of shoveling a grave in the air where you won't lie too cramped. Graves are in the ground, right? Graves are where people are buried. These are graves in the air. Certainly a reference, I think, to people being burned, going up essentially in smoke. You won't lie too cramped. I mean, a very dense and profoundly fraught line. So we have a couple of things going on here. We have Margareta and Sulamit, these two ideals of female beauty. One exists in Germany. One exists probably in a concentration camp. We have an SS officer who's writing to Germany, who calls up his Jews to do things, to dig graves and so forth. He gives orders. He tells them to dance. We know the historical reality of Jews having to perform dances and sing songs or play music in concentration camps while others worked or were beaten and so forth. We have this repetition, this striking repetition of day in and day out, the same kind of work over and over again, day in, day out, the same kind of starvation, the same kind of lack of nutrition. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, we drink and we drink. It starts again. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at morning and midday, we drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at midday and morning, we drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. And then yet a fourth time, black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at midday. Death is a master aus Deutschland. We drink you at evening and morning, we drink and we drink. It's almost the same, not quite. What do we make about this repetition? Why is this constantly this repetition of the black milk, but not quite exactly the same, almost the same, but not quite? What is the black milk? Metaphor? A reality? Is it milk gone bad? What do we make of it? Okay, possibly, sure. I mean, certainly, it calls to mind Black Flakes. I mean, another poem, Paul Celan poem. I think that certainly, this was actually written earlier than that one. No, that's actually not true. Sorry, this was written slightly afterwards. But it's the same. It's the same historical moment, right? Within a year of each other. Yeah, but I think you could also even see it literally as black milk. It's what they drank. This is, prisoners were given a certain amount of sustenance to get them through the day. A certain amount of soup, perhaps spoiled milk, perhaps coffee, black milk. The sense of this repetition of day in, day out, you're on the verge of starvation, and this is what you're given. This kind of sense of just nothing is changing, right? This idea of the repetition of the same exact thing, the same kind of work, the same kind of labor, the same kind of toil. And the only thing that intersects is death, right? Is that moment where at midday, death is a master aus Deutschland, enters into the poem, right? So that moment where it's repeated already 4 times, by the 4th time it goes, death has already come, taken someone away, probably through malnutrition or starvation or what have you, through beating, the person's been killed. We drink and we drink. So the sense of not a kind of inescapableness, a kind of a world which is so, it's the world that's become a concentration camp, as Elie Wiesel called it. And in the end, you have this strange binding together of these two figures, right? To end with death is a Meister, a master aus Deutschland. Meister is a very loaded term in Germany. Meister is like a musical composer. Bach was a Meister. Goethe, a poet, is a Meister. How's death? Death has been elevated to a master. Essentially, it's like a master composer, a master poet. Death is a master aus Germany, something that we do very well. We're the best at it. A master from Germany. And then the linking together of these two figures, the German and the Jewish. The European, Aryan, romantic German ideal and the Middle Eastern Jewish ideal. but one's burned and one's alive. So let's listen to Ceylon read the poem. And I think this is going to be very illuminating to us because we'll get a sense about the structure and the rhythm, and then we'll begin to understand a little bit more. Now that we have a sense about what it's about, we need to actually hear that this poem is meant to be not only read, but it's meant to be, you're meant to experience the rhythms of it. And then we'll listen to a fugue, which is, in order for us to understand that this poem is also meant to be like a fugue. So, let's turn this on. I'm going to follow. So this is Ceylon actually reading it. I'm going to just follow where he is.
Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken die abends, wir trinken die mittags und morgens, wir trinken die Nacht, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreit, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er streicht es und tritt vor das Haus, und es blicken die Sterne, er zeigt seine Rüden herbei, er zeigt seine Juden hervor, lässt schaukeln ein Grab in der Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sudanit. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Er greift nach den Eisen im Gurt, er schwingt, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sudanit, der spielt mit den Schlangen. Er ruft, spielt wüster den Tod, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Er ruft, streicht dunkler die Geigen, dann steigt ihr euch raus in die Luft. Dann habt ihr ein Grab in den Wolken, dann liegt man nicht eng. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er hebt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns ein Grab in der Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumet. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sudanit.
Okay. So when you hear Ceylon read it, he read a number of his poems, and they were recorded, and I think you get a sense a little bit about the rhythmic sense about what he intended in this poem. You hear the language of German, maybe you don't know the words necessarily, but you can begin to hear something about the inflection of the language. You begin maybe to have certain connotations about the imagery, about the sounds. Certain parts of the language sound, I think, very brutal. Other parts sound very dulcet and really quite nice. He speeds up at certain points. He slows down at certain points. I mean, when you hear him read it, what do you think? Why does he read it the way he does? I mean, do we learn anything from listening to him read it about the meaning of the poem? Is anything about where he pauses and how he speaks, does it enhance our understanding? Even just listening to the words? How does it sound to you? How does the German language sound? Yeah. Right. I mean, a sense of a kind of almost inevitable deterioration as the poem goes on and struggles. It goes through these 4 cycles, and I mean, it's important to recognize that there are 4 portions of this poem. You might even call them, if you use a musical term, there's 4 movements. There's a first movement, a second movement, a third movement, a fourth movement. Each one begins more or less the same way, but offers slight variations. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at morning, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, we drink and we drink. And then something happens. And then you get the same thing again, but it's just a slight variation. And then again in a slight variation. And then again with another variation, which is more significant because it's where death comes in. And then you have the poem coming to a kind of resolution in which the 2 protagonists, the 2 female protagonists, are brought together. But they're brought together in a way in which one is alive and one is presumably not. And it's that agonizing end, which as you read the poem, or as I read it, you wouldn't know that Ceylon had intended this kind of tremendously agonized and slow movement at the end, right? This very, very painful, articulated, almost struggling to say, Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. And those final lines so clearly articulated in a sense that there's something truly painful about articulating where this ends up. So let's go back to our question about a fugue. Who studies music here? Who knows what a fugue is? Who's played a fugue? Someone must. I'm not a music person. I'm not a musicologist. I know actually very little about music, I have to confess. What's a fugue? Okay. It doesn't necessarily have to be 3 parts, but certainly there's different parts that are introduced, but they parts have a relationship to each other. That's important. Anyone know what the relationship is between the different parts of a fugue? Well, the idea of a fugue is that it's contrapuntal, meaning that you have the introduction of one movement, which is a group of sounds and instruments. Then you have an introduction of another group of sounds, which are built on or related to the first group, but they're slightly different, and meaning one that's introduced is essentially the counterpoint to another. And essentially it kind of goes back and forth. So you have the introduction of one movement, you have the introduction of another movement. Then you might have a third movement, and then perhaps a fourth, perhaps a fifth and sixth. It doesn't have to be only 3. It can just can continue on indefinitely. But the point is that you have a group of sounds, a group of instruments introducing a particular movement, and then you have a counter movement. And the first movement isn't gone, but rather it becomes kind of sublimated by the second movement. So we need to understand what this is, because in a way this poem is mimicking the musical composition of a fugue. And the most famous fugue, which you'll have to now listen to, and I think it'll be very telling to understand the Death Fugue poem, is by Bach. It's the one that I'm going to play for you now, but I'm going to let you hear that first movement that's introduced. So you might say, black milk of daybreak, we drink it at morgen and drink it at mittags and so forth. That's the first movement linguistically of the poem. The first movement of the musical fugue is this. Stop there. It's that first part, right? So just play it again so you can hear it, because that's going to be reintroduced multiple times throughout this piece. There's a second one. There's a third one. So that's the first part of Bach's Art of the Fugue, Die Kunst der Fuge. This is from around 1740 or so, and is certainly something that Celan had in mind in calling his poem a death fugue. Not only is he mimicking in some ways the structural complexity of a fugue in terms of introducing a particular motif, and I think that motif is not only reintroduced and changed as the poem proceeds, but it has a kind of culminating end where everything kind of comes rushing down. This kind of intensity of the fugue, you'll notice as you heard it, at different times one part becomes dominant, another part becomes subservient. At other times a different motif enters in, but it's more or less the same, just slight variations, until you get to this point where you have a kind of rise, right? A kind of cathartic moment where many of the sounds in a kind of polyphony come together, almost then a release. And the release is as it goes to the end. And I think in the poem, the release is, of course, bringing these two figures together where death finally intervenes, where the person is, who's there, the Jew, is probably shot. Oops. Let's come back. Other, observations about the fugue. I mean, anyone who has a musical background and can help us to figure out a little bit more about how this poem might be reflecting the structure of a fugue. Do you see any other connections? I mean, certainly there's the repetition. There's certainly the idea of introducing a point and a counterpoint, and then another counterpoint, another. A sense of some kind of catharsis. Are there other connections to be made? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the point that she said, and I'm going to bear repeating out, the original movements aren't gone. They're not extinguished. In fact, they become subservient. So you have a new dominant that exists, but the idea is that they all persist until the very end, in which where it comes to its wrapping up. And that's exactly the case with Celan, constantly going back, the sense of kind of accumulation of different voices, and until it goes, in some sense, to its inevitable conclusion. Other thoughts about the fugue? So what about the issue that the fugue, I mean, is obviously, we listen to this, I mean, we listen to Bach, I mean, I think that any of us would probably agree that, I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, it sounds very pleasing to the ear. I mean, listen to Celan speak his German. I mean, maybe not beautiful. I don't know how it sounds to you. But how do we then understand this decision by Celan to call his poem, one, a death fugue, and then to cite this tradition of the beauty of the fugue connected now to the horror of the Holocaust? I mean, how do we begin to understand these two things relating to one another? How do we make sense of their coexistence? Why would the fugue be a model for writing poetry in 1944 or 1945? Why would the tradition of Bach and all of the all the beauty that connotes, and obviously Bach had nothing at all to do with the Holocaust, why would Celan bring that to bear? I mean, why would you put them together? I mean, what can we say that essentially, I mean, hasn't maybe been said, or what else can we add? Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's something to do with the female characters. I mean, remember, the two female characters, German, Jew, I think are certainly seen in some ways oppositionally, but they're also bound together in some way. That is to say, they're not just opposites. They share certain qualities. They're both women. They're both human beings. They may, in fact, have occupied the same space. They may have been neighbors. In the poem, they're put together at the end. They're not estranged from one another. It's just one happens to have ashen hair and one happens to have golden hair. Maybe one's just older and one's younger. Maybe one's dead and one's alive. We don't really know. But the point is, you have some sense about this counterpoint becomes a very significant motivation of this poem, just in the same way that it is for Bach, where you're introducing a particular movement and then another movement and then another and another. You're introducing German and Jewish and German and Jewish, and they're kind of bound to each other in a kind of strangely entangled, difficult way, not only as oppositions but also as maybe profoundly needing one another in some sense. Other thoughts about the fugue? Yeah. Wow, yeah. That's really interesting. I hadn't articulated that way. I think you're exactly right. I mean, the Holocaust, you could say, and we've talked about this already with the amazing amount of bureaucracy and choreography that it took. And I think I had used the term choreography to talk about what Eichmann did. This was essentially a composition. I mean, as kind of, horrible as that sounds, there was aspects of choreography, of coordination, of bringing together many different parts in order to make this happen efficiently and effectively, and from the perspective of the Nazis, perhaps beautifully. And amazingly, a fugue in some ways is also about that. A fugue is a composition that brings many different parts together, and it's a tremendous amount of coordination and creativity that results in a compositional element. And in some ways, the poem is that as well. Yeah, I think that's very striking. Yeah, I mean, the foreground, background, the dominant and subservient, those are always constantly parts of the structure of both, right? And I think it's something that we have to sort of pay attention to. Not everything is at the same level, right? Different things enter in at different moments, and those gain different kinds of valuation. So I would like you to stay for a couple more minutes because I want to actually play them together, the fugue and Ceylon, because I think that we'll gain yet another understanding if you hear them simultaneously. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll be done today.